My son called me on a Tuesday morning to tell me I wasn't welcome at his university graduation ceremony. The ceremony I had driven 4 hours each way, 47 times, to make sure he got to. He didn't say it cruelly. That's the thing about Lachlan. He never says anything cruelly. He says it carefully, the way you'd read a weather warning out loud, as if the disaster is just a fact and not something anyone chose. Mom, Bridget's family is flying in from Calgary, and there's only so many tickets, and we thought it would be easier if you just watched the live stream. You understand, right? I said I understood. I hung up the phone and I sat in my kitchen in Sudbury with my coffee going cold, and I looked at my hands. The left one has a scar across the knuckle from a job site in 2003, when I was still doing the work myself instead of managing the people who did it. The right one has a patch of rough skin below the thumb that never quite healed right after 15 winters of gripping scaffolding in -30 weather. They are not the hands of a woman who watches things on a live stream. My name is Carol Tremblay. I'm 63 years old and I run a mid-size roofing and exterior contracting company out of Sudbury, Ontario. We do residential and commercial. We have 22 employees. I started it in 1991 with a second-hand pickup truck, a nail gun I bought at an estate sale, and a debt to my father that I paid back within the year. I raised Lachlan alone starting when he was 7, because his father decided that a wife who worked construction was not the kind of wife he'd had in mind when he said the words. I worked days and I hired a neighbor woman to collect Lachlan from school, and I was home by 6 most nights and by 8 on the hard ones, and I never once missed a parent-teacher interview. Not one. I went in my work clothes sometimes, with mud on my boots, and I sat in those little plastic chairs, and I asked his teachers what my son needed, and I went home and I gave it to him. I need you to understand all of that before I tell you what happened next, because what happened next is going to make you angry at my son, and I don't want you angrier at him than I am. He is not a bad person. He is a kind person who got afraid of something and started making choices he'll carry a long time. I know, because I watched it happen one small step at a time over 3 years, and I kept telling myself it was just adjustment, just the natural pulling away of a young man building his own life. I was wrong. It was something else entirely. I just couldn't see it until he told me to watch my own son's graduation on a laptop. Lachlan met Bridget Ashworford at Laurentian in his 2nd year. Bridget is from Calgary, which in this story matters only because it meant her family had no history with us, no context, no picture of who we were before Bridget decided who we were. They looked at Lachlan and they saw a young man who'd pulled himself up, who'd come from modest means and made something of himself, which, in their telling, did not include me. I was the modest means. I was the thing he'd pulled himself up from. The Ashfords are comfortable people. Not wealthy in any old money sense, but comfortable in the way that comes from 2 professional salaries over a long marriage and kids who never wanted for anything. Bridget's father works in oil and gas management. Her mother, Sandra, coordinates events for a foundation in Calgary. They summer at a lake property in the Okanagan. They use the word summer as a verb. They are perfectly pleasant people in the way that people are pleasant when they have never been made uncomfortable by anything, which means they are pleasant until you are. I met them at Lachlan and Bridget's engagement dinner in Ottawa, where the kids had moved after graduation. I drove down. I brought wine, a good bottle, from a winery near Niagara I'd visited with my friend Donna. Sandra Ashford took the bottle with both hands and said, "Oh, how thoughtful," in the voice people use when they've already decided what the evening will be. Her husband, Glenn, shook my hand and asked what I did, and when I told him roofing and exteriors, he said, "Oh, well, that's certainly essential work." Essential, as if I'd told him I was a necessary inconvenience. I let it go. You let things go at engagement dinners. You smile and you pass the bread and you tell yourself this is about your son being happy and not about whether Glenn Ashford thinks your work is essential. Over the months that followed, I learned something about the Ashfords that I didn't know at that dinner. They had opinions about everything, and they communicated those opinions through Bridget, who communicated them through Lachlan. who delivered them to me in that careful, weathercast voice of his. "Mom." Bridget's parents were thinking the rehearsal dinner should probably be in Ottawa, since most of the guests are coming from their side. "Mom, the Ashfords have kind of a vision for the reception, and it might be simpler if you just contributed to the general fund rather than coordinating anything directly. Mom, Sandra has this caterer she's worked with before, and they're going to handle the whole menu." I had offered to pay for the wedding. $45,000. Every cent of it, from a company I'd built in a city they'd never visit. And bit by bit, through a series of conversations that all began with Mom, Bridget's family, I was being thanked for my check and shown the door. Now, here is the part that matters. Here is the part where the cleaning lady, as they'd have called me if cleaning were what I did, turns out to have been reading the paperwork all along. When I agreed to fund the wedding, I did not write a check to the Ashfords, or to a joint account, or to anyone named Bridget. I have been in business for 32 years. I know what a blank check means. I went through every vendor myself. I called the venue, a restored heritage hall in Gatineau that I will tell you now was absolutely beautiful. I called the caterer, the photographer, the florist, and the string quartet Bridget had her heart set on. I asked for the contracts. I read them myself, and I had my accountant's daughter, a family lawyer named Therese, review the cancellation clauses before I signed anything. And I signed everything as Carol Tremblay, principal party, responsible for all deposits and payments. Therese had said something while she was reviewing them. She said it the way lawyers say things they want you to hear, but don't want to be remembered for saying. She said, "Carol, you're the sole signatory on every one of these. If anything changed, the refund authority sits entirely with you. Not with the venue's other contacts, not with whoever's been CC'd on the planning emails. You." I said, "Nothing's going to change it, Therese. It's my son's wedding," she said. "Of course. Just good to know the geography." I thought about that word later. Geography. Where things sit. Where the power is, drawn on a map you can't see until you need it. I kept that map in a manila folder in the drawer under my kitchen island, the drawer I use for important documents. I forgot about it, the way you forget about your passport when you're not going anywhere. I'd remember it on a Tuesday morning in April while my coffee went cold, and my son's words about the live stream were still sitting in the air. Let me tell you about the graduation tickets, because that is where this starts. But it's not where it began. It began at Christmas the year before. Lachlan and Bridget had come to Sudbury, first time they'd visited in over a year, and I'd cooked for 2 days. My friend Donna came over Christmas Eve, and my neighbor Art, who'd known Lachlan since he was in primary school, and my cousin Fern, who drives up from North Bay every year. It was a good table. It was loud and warm, and full of people who loved each other without needing to perform it. Bridget was quiet. Not unfriendly, exactly. Quiet in a careful way, looking around my house, the way someone looks at a rental they've been told is adequate. At dinner, when Art started telling the story about the winter, Lachlan helped him patch his roof at 17 and nearly took a header off the dormer. Bridget laughed politely and then looked at her phone. When Lachlan told it himself, leaning forward, animated, she put her hand on his arm in a way that stopped the story short. Later, I heard her on the phone with Sandra from the hallway saying, "It's a lot, you know? It's just a different world." A different world. My kitchen, where I'd fed this boy 3 times a day for 18 years, was a different world. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was nerves, it was the holidays, it was 2 families finding their footing. I am good at talking myself into patience. 30 years of running a crew has made me good at it, but I felt it. The slow rearranging of my son. The way he got a little quieter around me at that Christmas. The way he laughed differently, shorter, more monitored. The way he stopped telling the stories about growing up here, the real ones, the ones with the truck and the nail gun, and the nights I was late home gun and he'd made us both toast and we'd sat at this same table and done his homework together. He'd always told those stories with pride. He told them differently now. Like they were something that had happened to a character in a book he'd read and didn't particularly recommend. After Christmas, the calls got shorter. The visits stopped entirely. There was always a reason. The drive. Work. Bridget's family was in town. I told myself it was normal. I told myself it was the Ashfords visiting from Calgary and not my son choosing them over me. I told myself I was being sensitive. That is the trap, by the way, that they set for you without knowing they've set it. They count on you loving your child enough to explain away everything. Your love becomes the excuse you make for them. I made that excuse for 2 years. Then the graduation came. Lachlan had gone back for a second degree, a professional program in urban planning. Donna had said, "Carol, you should be so proud. That boy gets his drive from you." I was proud. I am proud. Pride is not the thing I lost. What I lost, or nearly did, was the sense that I had any right to show it. The tickets. Every graduate was given 4 tickets. Lachlan gave 2 to Bridget and 2 to Sandra and Glenn. Not one to me. He called to tell me about livestream on a Tuesday. I said I understood, and I hung up and I sat there for a long time. Then I called Donna. Donna has known me since we were 24. She was my first non-family client, hired me to reshingle her parents' bungalow in 1992 and told every person she knew. Half my early business came from Donna's mouth. She is the kind of friend who tells you the truth even when it costs her something. I told her about the live stream, about the tickets, about the Christmas visit, and the different world comment and the 2 years of shorter calls. I told her all of it, compressed into about 10 minutes, and Donna was quiet the whole time, which is how I knew she was angry. When I finished, she said, "Carol, are you hearing yourself?" I said I knew how it sounded. She said, "I don't think you do. You built a company from a used truck, and you raised that boy in it, and you paid for this wedding, and they gave your 4 tickets to the in-laws and told you to sit home and watch a screen." I said, "It's his day." "I don't want to make it about me," she said. "It's already about you. They made it about you when they decided the woman who built everything wasn't worth a seat in the hall. You not making a fuss doesn't make it not about you. It just makes it quiet." And then she says the thing I've been thinking about ever since. She said, "You have spent 30 years teaching other people's sons how to do a job that lasts. When are you going to teach your own son what it looks like when someone respects themselves?" I drove home that night. I didn't decide anything yet. I sat in the kitchen. I looked at the folder in the drawer. I thought about Teresa's word. Geography. I gave it one more chance. I always give one more chance. I called Lachlan that evening. I said, "Son, I need to talk to you about the tickets, because I think maybe there's been some confusion." I said it gently. I gave him every opening. He said, "Mom, I know, and I'm sorry. It's just that the Ashfords flew from Calgary, and they've been planning around this for months, and Bridget really needed them there. And there were only 4 tickets." I said, "Lachlan, I'm your mother." He said, "I know, Mom, and I love you," but Sandra said, and that was the sentence. Sandra said. That was where I stopped giving more chances. Because that sentence had been running my son's life for 3 years, and he hadn't noticed, and I had noticed and said nothing. And now I was being asked to watch my own son graduate on a laptop at 63 years old. Because Sandra said, I said, "I see. Let me think about this." I hung up. I pulled the folder out of the drawer. I don't act in anger. I never have. You don't survive 30 Northern Ontario winters in the trades by acting in anger. You check your position, you look at what's in front of you, you decide what you're able to do, and you do it clearly. The venue contract. Heritage Hall in Gatineau, deposit of $8,000, balance owing 3 weeks before the event. The event was 6 weeks out. I was within the window Therese had circled. The refund clause was broad if initiated by the principal party. I was the principal party. The caterer. Similar terms, the florist, the photographer, the quartet. Every single one of them signed Carol Tremblay. Every single one. I called Therese the next morning. I didn't call her at 11 at night like some people might. I called her at 8 in the morning before I left for a job site because I am a morning person, and I wanted to be on the road before I could reconsider. I told her about the tickets, about Sandra said, about 2 years of being slowly moved off the map. Therese was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Carol, you know what you're asking me." I said, "I know what I'm asking you." She said, "If I send these cancellation notices, there is no wedding. Not at these vendors, not on this date." I said, "I know what there isn't. What I want to know is whether I have the right, she said. You are the sole signatory on every contract. You have every right, I said. Send the notices. Now, here is the part I want you to understand, because this is the part that made it real. I did not call Lachlan first. I did not text Bridget to warn her. I did not ask for one last conversation, one last chance to be talked back into being reasonable about it. I have learned, over a long time of being a person who can always be talked into being reasonable, that there is a moment when reasonableness stops being a virtue and becomes a tool someone else uses on you. I had been reasonable for 2 years. I had been understanding about Christmas. I had been gracious about the rehearsal dinner and the caterer and the general fund. I had been mature and uncomplaining about every single thing they had asked me to let go of. And they had looked at all of that grace and seen permission. They had looked at my silence and decided it was consent. I gave Therese the go-ahead, and I drove to a job site in Hanmer, and I put on my hard hat, and I spent the morning doing what I have done since I was 31 years old. I managed a job. I checked the flashing around a dormer on a commercial property. I ate lunch in my truck. I drove home at 4. Lachlan called at 4:30. He had heard from Bridget, who had heard from Sandra, who had received a cancellation notice from the caterer. The call was not calm. Mom, what did you do? His voice was the voice of someone who had been frightened very suddenly and hadn't caught up to why. The caterer called Bridget. They said the contract's been canceled. Sandra is. Mom, what is happening? I said. I did what I told you I'd do. He said, you didn't say you'd do anything. You said you'd think about it. I said, I thought about it. This is the result. There was a pause, a long one. Mom, the wedding is in 6 weeks. We have 60 guests. People have flights. The Ashfords. I said, Lachlan, I need you to listen to me, not as your mother, as a person. I paid for this wedding. Every vendor, every deposit, every contract has my name on it, and not one of them has the Ashfords' name on it. I did that on purpose because I've been in business long enough to know that if you're the one paying, you put your name on the paperwork. Now, I have spent 3 years being the person you love quietly, and at a distance, which I understand. Children grow up and make their own lives. But I was not invited to my son's graduation because Sandra from Calgary said, and if I was not worth one of 4 seats in that hall, then I am not going to fund the event at which they would have seated me somewhere dignified, but not the front. He said, Mom, that's not what this was about. I said, then tell me what it was about. Another silence. He said, it's complicated. Bridget's relationship with her parents is really important to her, and I said, Lachlan, stop, not harshly, but completely. I said, I have watched you turn yourself into a person I sometimes don't recognize for 3 years, and I have stayed quiet because I thought it was growing pains, adjustment, a young man finding his footing. I am not quiet anymore, not because I'm angry, because I'm your mother and I love you, and what I will not do is keep funding a version of our relationship where I am the woman who pays and isn't invited. He didn't have an answer for that. He said, I need to call Bridget. I said, you should. He said, Mom, they can't cover this. The Ashfords can't just. They weren't planning on. I said, I know. I suspect I knew that before you did. There was something in the silence after that, something shifting. I heard him breathing. He said, they told me it would be embarrassing. To have. They said it was better if your professional background wasn't the thing people focused on at the wedding, and there it was. I said, who is they? He didn't answer, but we both knew. I said, your mother builds structures that stand for 40 years in weather that would flatten most things. That is not something to be managed around. That is something you come from, he said. Mom, in a voice I hadn't heard since he was 10 and had broken something and was trying to figure out if I already knew. I said, go call Bridget. We'll talk tomorrow. What happened over the next 4 days I know partly from Lachlan and partly from what you can piece together when you have been watching something build for a long time. Sandra Ashford had apparently assumed, with the confidence of a woman who has never been told no by a situation, that the deposits were soft, negotiable, recoverable. She called the venue herself. The venue told her that the sole signatory, a woman named Carol Tremblay, had formally initiated cancellation. and that refund procedures were underway, and that Sandra was not listed on any documentation that gave her authority to reverse this. Sandra was not accustomed to being told by a venue that she was not on the documentation. She called Glenn. Glenn called Lachlan. Lachlan called me twice in one evening. I let the first call go to voicemail because I was in the middle of dinner and because I had said what I needed to say, and more words before he'd had time to think were not going to help either of us. The voicemail was contrite. It said he was sorry. It said he'd been doing something he didn't fully realize he'd been doing. It said the Ashfords were not able to cover the venue, and he didn't know if any of this could be fixed. But he needed me to know he was sorry. I called him back after dinner. He answered on the first ring. He said, "I gave your ticket to Sandra, not Bridget's mother, not her." "Sandra," I said. "I know." He said, "She asked for it, and I said yes without thinking, and then I thought the live stream thing would. I thought you'd understand." I said, "I did understand. That's actually the problem. I've been understanding things for 3 years that I should have questioned." He said, "What do I do, Mom?" And here is the thing about loving your children. Even when they've handed your seat away, even when they've let someone else decide that your work is embarrassing and your table is a different world, and you can watch the important things on a screen, you still love them the same way you always have. You just can't keep pretending that love is the same as permission. I said, "First you tell me what you actually want. Not what Bridget needs and not what the Ashfords expect. What do you want?" He was quiet long enough that I knew he hadn't been asked that in a while. He said, "I want you there, Mom. I always wanted you there. I don't know how it got to the live stream." I said, "I know how. You got afraid of disappointing people and you ran out of things to give them, so you gave them mine." He said, "Yeah, that's one of the things I love most about my son. When he finally hears himself, he doesn't argue. He just says, 'Yeah.' He gets it from me. I also just say 'yeah' when there's nothing to argue with." I said, "Here is what's going to happen. I am going to speak to Therese, and we are going to look at what can be reinstated and what can't, because some of those vendors may have moved on, and I'm not going to make promises I can't keep. Whatever is recoverable, I will look at recovering, on one condition," he said. "Anything," I said, "not anything. One thing. You and Bridget make the decision about this wedding together without her parents' input. Not their money, not their logistics, not their seating preferences. This is your wedding, and it should reflect who you both are, which includes where you came from and who raised you. If Bridget can do that, we try again. If the Ashfords need their names on things, then they can put their names on the contracts." He said, "I'll talk to Bridget." I said, "You should. Here is what happened. Bridget." And I want to be fair to her because she was not the villain in this story, any more than my son was. Bridget had been raised in a particular world, and the particular world had particular ideas about what a wedding looked like. Her mother had very strong ideas, and Bridget loved her mother, and somewhere in the planning she'd let her mother's ideas become everyone's ideas. I don't think she meant to erase me. I think she just stopped noticing I was there, which is a different kind of thing and still needs correcting. She called me herself. 2 days after the caterer called her, she called from a number I didn't have saved and I almost didn't pick up, but something told me to. She said, "Carol, it's Bridget." I said, "I know." She said, "I owe you an apology that I'm probably going to do badly, but I want to try anyway." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "I let my mom take over everything, and I knew she was doing it, and I told myself you wouldn't mind because you were busy and because you weren't as excited about all the details as she was. And I think what I actually mean is that my mom made it seem like you weren't as invested, and I believed her because it was easier than asking you." I said, "I built $45,000 worth of investment into the contracts I signed. I was invested." She laughed, a small surprised sound. She said, "Lachlan told me about the paperwork." She paused. He was proud when he told me. "I don't think he'd let himself be proud of you properly in a long time. I'm sorry for that too." I said, "Bridget, do you want to get married?" She said, "Yes, more than anything." I said, "To Lachlan specifically?" She laughed again, more fully. She said, "Yes, to Lachlan specifically." I said, Then let's see what we can put back together. 3 of the 5 vendors were able to reinstate. The venue had not yet released the date. Therese made the calls. The caterer had already begun rebooking, and we lost that deposit. Fair enough, the clause was clear, and the florist needed 2 weeks' notice to resource what they'd begun releasing. We found a different caterer, less formal, better food as it turned out. The flowers were simpler. Nobody who was there would tell you they suffered. The Ashfords came. Of course they came. You don't fly from Calgary and not come. Sandra was cooler with me than she had been at the engagement dinner, which was cooler than comfortable. But she sat in her seat and she was polite, and at the dinner afterward, she told someone that Lachlan's mother had built her own company from scratch, which, well, small things. I sat in the front row. Not because I insisted, because Lachlan saved the seat with his hand on the back of the chair when he walked me to it. He didn't make a speech about it. He just put his hand on the chair and looked at me and said, "This one's yours, Mom. It's always been yours." I have been in cold weather in November on a roof that wasn't secured, and I did not cry. I cried at that. I am allowed. The caterer we'd lost the deposit to sent a very professional note saying the date had been rebooked and the venue was lovely, and they hoped the event went well. It did. It went very well. Therese sent me her final invoice and wrote at the bottom, in her own handwriting, "Good to know the geography, Carol." I framed it. It hangs in my office next to my first business license and a photo of the truck. Donna danced at the reception until her shoes gave out. Lachlan danced with me and with her, and he danced with Sandra too, because he is fundamentally a gracious person, my son, and that is one of the things he got from me, and I will say so plainly. What I spent on that wedding, in the end, was about $38,000 of the $45,000, once the recovered deposits were factored. The rest I put into a joint savings account for Lachlan and Bridget, with a note that said, "For your first house or your first hard year, whichever comes first." Because money given to people who see you is a gift. Money given to people who want your hand open and your face turned away is something else. And I spent enough years learning that difference. I ran into Glenn Ashford at the gift table during the reception. He handed me a glass of wine. He said, "Your company does roofing, you said." I said, "Roofing and exteriors, yes." He said, "We've been having some trouble with our flat roof in Calgary." Ice damming. I said, "That's a drainage and insulation issue usually. You need someone to look at the slope." He said, "Right, yeah. Do you know anyone out there?" I gave him a name, a good one, a company I'd trained a foreman who'd moved west in 2015. I said, "Tell them Carol Tremblay sent you. They'll do right by you." He nodded. He said, "I didn't realize how much you knew about this stuff." I said, "I've been doing it for 32 years, Glenn." He said, Right, of course." He moved away. I finished my wine. I did not need him to understand. I have long since stopped needing people like Glenn Ashford to understand what I know, which is a freedom that took me a long time to buy for myself and that I intend to keep. People ask me sometimes if I regret the cancellations, the disruption, whether it was worth it for a seat at a ceremony. It was never a seat. That is the thing they don't understand when they ask. It was the shape of things to come. It was the model. It was what Lachlan was learning about what a woman who builds things does when she's told that the building doesn't count. I could have watched on the laptop. I could have been gracious and patient and full of understanding for one more thing. I have been gracious and patient and full of understanding for 32 years, and it has built me a company and a son and a life I am proud of. But it does not work on people who take your grace as permission to keep taking. What works is the same thing that works on every job site I have ever run. Clarity, documentation, knowing exactly where your name is signed and what authority that gives you, and being willing, when the moment arrives, to use it. Lachlan called me on a Sunday morning a few months after the wedding. He called just to talk, the way he hadn't in years. We were on the phone for an hour. He told me about a project he was working on, urban green space in an old industrial quarter, and I told him about a commercial job in the valley we were bidding on, and we talked about his grandmother and about the truck and about the winter he helped Art with the dormer and nearly came off the eave. He told the story all the way through this time, both of us laughing. At the end, he said, "Mom, I want to bring Bridget up to Sudbury this summer. Show her around properly." I said, "I'd like that." He said, "I want to show her where the company started. The first job site. She's been asking about it." I said, "The dentist's office on Elm is a dental supply warehouse now, but the bones are the same. We could drive by." He said, "Yeah, let's do that. You raise them. You teach them what you know. You let them go so far that you can't see them anymore, and you wait, because they are yours, and you are theirs, and that doesn't have an off switch no matter what. And if you've done the work right, not perfectly, but truly, they find their way back to you. Not because you held on, because you showed them what it looks like to stand in your own kitchen and know your own worth and not apologize for either one. That's all any of us can do. Hold the contracts. Know the geography. Keep the door in view even when you have no intention of walking through it. And when someone hands you a screen and says this is enough for someone like you, set down the cup, open the drawer, and remind yourself and them exactly whose name is on the paperwork.